Mr. Yates, おはようございます。
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you.
Do you speak Japanese?
Only a little bit. So some basic greetings and to say, Nihongo dekimasen, sumimasen.
ちゃんとできます。You've been in Japan before?
I have visited Japan many times, and in college I took one semester of Japanese
Right.
before I realized it was just too hard.
Really?
So Chinese worked more easily for me.
No kidding.
In Chinese, there's no plurality, no gender, no tense, no conjugation of verbs.
そうか。
And so for my simple brain, it was
Oh,
easier.
come
But I greatly enjoyed studying Japanese, and I have many friends in Japan that have served in government. So when I worked at the Heritage Foundation before, I would visit Japan and had some friends that did research. And then when I served in the White House, I had many friends who worked for the government of Japan. And a lot of those people remain friends today. So been
So you
very,
still
very
have a
blessed.
strong tie with Japan too?
Yes, very close friendships.
Okay. So what does the Heritage Foundation do, by the way?
Well, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative public policy research institution, and it has a decidedly ideological point of view in terms of its mission. It advocates policy based on those principles. They don't necessarily advocate to vote for or against bills. That would be what lobbying firms do in DC. But they can argue what policies are more consistent with conservative principles, and people can draw their own conclusions.
So who would listen to the opinion or advice from a foundation? President?
I think most of the heritage research targets, first and foremost, Capitol Hill. I'm sure that there's plenty of research that's meant to be relevant to the executive branch, but Capitol Hill is very close in geography to where heritage is, and that's on purpose.
So in a way, it's a pretty powerful organization.
Definitely has its publications read. It has hundreds of thousands of members that contribute large and small amounts of money from all around America. It has well over 200, maybe more, permanent employees in the foundation. And some of us, when I worked there in the 1990s, I think there were a group of 5 or 6 of us that went to serve in the Bush administration after serving at Heritage. And so some people can go have some research and public policy experience there and prepare to serve as an appointed official in government later in their career.
So, Mr. Yates, after Mr. President George Bush administration, the next one was Obama, Mr. Obama.
Yeah.
Then now is Mr. Trump. So, prior to George Bush, maybe you had nothing to do with the White House.
Right.
So, let's say we start from George Bush White House until today's Mr. Trump White House. What do you see all these 16 years change in the United States?
Well, there are a couple of very important changes, but first I'd remind some of the viewers of the things that are the same. When I worked for President Bush, the mostly liberal, progressive, Democrat critics of his would march in the streets and say that he was racist, to say that he was against women's rights. They had pictures of him with a Hitler mustache on it. He was called all kinds of terrible things. And so today, when people say these things about Donald Trump and the people who support him, a lot of times people forget that these same people said the same things about George W. Bush.
You say the same thing to Mr. President.
Right, so that part is the same. In the media, by and large, the major media is very critical of the president, mostly more critical of Republican presidents, I would say. So that remains the same. Tough media environment, a lot of, I think, extremist critics that say outrageous things all the time. The difference now is the advent of social media. And so President Trump participates in that because of his very, very intriguing Twitter feed.
He really doesn't want to have a so-called press conference and let the reporters write something different from what he said.
Well, that's another thing that has changed a lot. And it started out somewhat more conventional, but now he takes the model where he is his own press secretary, and he will choose to take the press out onto the South Lawn in front of a helicopter that's getting ready to leave, and he'll take, for however long he chooses, direct questions from reporters. And so none of the reporters can really complain legitimately that he's not having press conferences. He's actually more available to the press than almost any president has ever been, but it's under an environment he chooses. What they noticed was in the White House press briefing room, the reporters were grandstanding for the cameras, and so the news coverage was more about the reporter than about what the president or an official was saying. And so Donald Trump, being a TV personality, he took control of the theater and made it so that if he's standing out in front of a warming up helicopter getting ready to go, the cameras have to stay focused on him.
Pretty
and
smart.
he can control that the ability of reporters to perform for the camera. And so that's why he does what he does that way.
No wonder every time I said, why he went to conduct a press conference in front of the helicopter where it's so noisy and he has to yell so loud.
There is a reason.
I see.
And I have to say, it seems to have worked reasonably well for him. I don't think the next president can do things exactly the way Donald Trump has. There are things he can do that I don't think anyone else can get away with doing.
So Mr. Trump apparently very kind of close tie to Taiwan, and then of course a close tie to Japan because Japan and Taiwan, the sea lane is all chained over there. So sometimes Mr. Trump could be very tough to Japan.
Yes.
And what do you think is that kind of just talk, or he really kind of tough to Japan, especially in trade, in terms of the trade?
Well, when he was coming of age in the 70s and 80s, he spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about U.S.-Japan economic relations. And he felt like it was an unfair relationship.
In
he
70s
spoke
and
out
80s?
very, very publicly about that. And there's some TV interviews you can find. And even sometimes in the not too distant past, you could hear him say things that were critical of Japan's lack of market access for American goods.
It's been talked like that for decades.
Yes, and so some of it is what he really believes, and it's been a part of his life. Now, I don't think it's personal animus. I think it just comes from his sense of economic nationalism, of wanting to be really American first and pushing for better deals for American companies, especially manufacturing and trade and all of that.
For his constituents, too.
Correct. It's helping the constituents. But when it comes to the personal relationship, I think President Trump has a genuinely positive personal friendship with Prime Minister Abe.
Well, that's very nice to know.
He doesn't ever, Prime Minister Abe's name only has 3 letters, but President Trump always pronounces it differently. So he always calls him Prime Minister Abe. And it's kind of funny that this short name, it's easy to say Abe, and he says Abe. But it's just a fun twist.
Kind of cute, though.
But they love playing golf together. They have long conversations. There's very frequent dialogue. Some of the president's most trusted advisors, like Matt Pottinger, who's now Deputy National Security Advisor, he's had lots of interaction with counterparts in Japan. And I think there's broad overlap with Prime Minister Abe's national security strategy. A lot of what he talked about in terms of an open Indo-Pacific region has been adopted by the Trump administration as its national security strategy. So there's broad agreement and I think genuine friendship. But the president, when you talk about economics, he will play and talk tough, especially with friends. He does it to the British. He does it to the Europeans.
He
does it with the Canadians.
That's right.
Anybody. So the Japanese people should just feel like family.
Family sometimes could be very critical.
Yes.
But as far as the national security is concerned for Japan, I think Japan, because of the constitution, cannot have an army or military.
Right.
But if America is willing to help Japan anytime if there's a problem there in Japan, do you think America really would help Japan?
I think that most Americans and most American leaders genuinely would honor our ally obligations. But the most dangerous position for a president to be in is to have a very clear alliance obligation and a public that is not ready to understand why they have to do what they're being asked to do. And so that's...
So do you think Japan should change their constitution eventually?
Number one, I respect that it's the will of the Japanese people that need to figure out which way they want to go. But as an American, I want Japan to be treated like a normal nation. I think it has a right to be a normal nation. I get sick and tired of listening to demagogues from China trying to talk about history when that was many decades ago. And there are only so many ways someone can approach this issue of apology, and the other side never be willing to accept it as enough.
So it's Korea.
The same. Well, so I have the same feeling. But the difference between Korea and China is that China has a history problem too. It killed more Chinese people. The Communist Party of China has killed more Chinese people than any other organization on this planet, and in much more brutal ways. And so the Communist Party of China attacked the Chinese people. It's attacked the institutions of family, attacked the institutions of faith, attacked the language, the culture, its history. They established a new China. All of this is more recent than World War II. And so if the government of China, in all of its hypocrisy, wants to try to lecture other people about history, it has some history to atone for itself. But Japan, on the other hand, has taken the road of a modern, tolerant, inclusive, responsible democracy. That is a reliable ally and partner. That, I think, is worthy of respect. No matter what happens in the past. I have a grandfather that served in the Pacific campaign of World War II for 4 tours, fighting Japanese soldiers on the other side.
No kidding.
To his dying day, he remained very anti-Japanese.
Really?
When I came home from Taiwan, he was quite concerned that I had gone to Japan.
Oh boy.
So for him, it was a very traumatic experience, and I could understand that. But he passed away. And a lot of that emotion and anxiety about that unique period of history should pass with that generation. And we should recognize the generations that are rising up that are free, thoughtful, tolerant, responsible people.
Right.
And so I fully support the idea of Japan having its own constitution. And I think President Trump, when he talks about the alliance and burden sharing and redefining some of America's commitments around the world, it's not to say the United States wouldn't support Japan, but he wants our allies and partners to have their own deterrent capability, to have self-defense and self-respect. And if people invest more of their own resources to take care of themselves, then it makes it easier to convince Americans that in a time of need, we can help those who are prepared to help themselves.
That's right. That's right. In Japan, we say, you are the one to protect your own castle. Nobody else could. That's all the Japanese saying. Mr. Yates, after commercial, let's talk some more. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Yates, what do you think that eventually what kind of role America would play in Asia with current bully China and somehow kind of mixed up feeling with Korea Peninsula?
Right.
It seems to me a very tense relation with Japan and of course with America.
Right.
What do you think it eventually would happen?
Well, first I'd focus on the things that I believe we can control. So the things we can control are our defense capabilities, our education systems, and making sure that we strengthen our own institutions, tell the truth to our people about the nature of the Communist Party, the nature of China, and the challenges it presents. Tell the truth to our people about who our friends are and all that we're willing to do to help work with one another. I hope that America does a better job of being seen as a positive contributor to economic development in Japan, and Japan does a better job of being seen as a partner to economic development in the United States. Our governments and our peoples have done a lot. I don't mean to say that it's been small, but our people need to see it and feel it. We talked a little bit about the 1980s in the earlier part of our conversation, and people felt like Japan was taking advantage of America. One way that was resolved was by Japanese companies somewhat assimilating, so that today when someone looks at a Japanese car brand, they don't think of it as a foreign car.
That's right.
When they look at a Japanese television, they don't think of it as a foreign product. And so,
because it's made in the United States too.
And these names have just become Americanized.
I see.
And so that was a wise strategy. But the one downside of that strategy is people don't understand that this is Japan's contribution to America's way of life. This is Japan's contribution to economic development, jobs, manufacturing in the United States. And so we need to revive some elements of that.
I see.
So we can control what we do to help each other. We can control how we communicate with our people, and we could do a better job with that.
It's almost the same thing as 30-some years ago.
Yes, it's a new challenge,
Right.
Same challenge, but
Right.
for a new era.
Right.
But the part that I think is really different and is really important that we can't control entirely is the dominant variable. The dominant variable is do the Chinese people ever get to live outside the government of the Communist Party of China? So is the demonstration in Hong Kong the beginning of the end of the CCP? The way the 8th decade of the Soviet Union was its last? Is the 8th decade of the CCP going to be the end of one-party rule in China? If that were to happen, I think that there's a lot of goodwill in the United States, Japan, other places, to engage with the good people of China. We are not anti-China, but we are
Communist
100%
Party.
against the brutality and selfishness of the Communist Party. And so if...
There are a lot of nice Chinese people in our neighborhood and on the
Right.
street too.
And there's great cultures and traditions
Yes.
that we can celebrate and respect. But the communist era is not a good one. And so if the Communist Party remains in power and it gets stronger and it keeps using the weapons of freedom like internet and access to our peoples to try to undermine our institutions, then our biggest challenge is to figure out how do we effectively work together to preserve the institutions of freedom in our own country, but then try to make it harder for the Communist Party to continue to do what it's doing to its own people. That's something that our public has not been well prepared to do, but the conversation around the world has begun on this subject. I think Hong Kong has accelerated that conversation. Vice President Pence gave a speech at the Hudson Institute last year, and he gave a speech at the Woodrow Wilson Center just recently that talk about some of the deep challenges that we face by the Communist Party inside China, in the international system, and in our own countries. That's a new mission for our alliance. If we focus on that mission, our alliance can be very well understood and strong between our peoples. That's very, very important in my view.
So Mr. Trump has 4 more years to go.
I believe the odds are that he will be reelected, partly because he's such a larger-than-life personality. He goes and campaigns around the country and continues to fill auditoriums in the tens of thousands of attendees. No Democrat that's running for president right now is able to do anything that comes close. Right now, the Democrats are fighting very hard with each other. At some point, they will have a nominee, and maybe they will unify behind that nominee, but they face a real dilemma. How do they criticize President Trump for a trade policy that used to be the Democrats' trade policy? And so in the 1980s and the 1990s, the policy that President Trump is advocating now used to be the Democrats' policy. And they have parts of their party that support what he's doing. A lot of labor Democrats have wanted for a long time for presidents, Republican and Democrat, to take a tougher approach toward China and to focus more on bringing some manufacturing back to the United States. And I think that's been positive. They said it was impossible to renegotiate NAFTA. And yet, even though he says very spicy things from time to time, he has been able to renegotiate a new NAFTA, the USMCA. And Congress needs to pass that. But if they pass that, there'll be a revitalization of economic development in Mexico, Canada, and trade in North America that will offset the challenges we have in the U.S.-China relationship. That will be something very hard for Democrats to run against. We have historically low unemployment, especially among minorities. And so how do you run against that? Well, they'll try. And we already know what they'll say. But right now, I think that the odds are quite good. And I think that's in ways that are unexpected by many of my friends in Asia. I think it's good for alliances. I think it's good for rebalancing America's influence around the world. And it's an opportunity for our partners to step up and contribute to that conversation. So I'm very happy about that.
Mr. Yates, no problem. Can you tell me what's the most important part for Mr. Trump to prove that he can be reelected, or to tell people this is what you got to elect me?
Well, I think he has to remain very firm on these trade negotiations.
Trade is the first priority.
That is the crossover issue that Republicans and Democrats can largely agree on. I hope he can remain strong speaking up for those who seek freedom. He inherently does, even though his reputation sometimes is described otherwise. And some of the things he said about Hong Kong have been, I think, mixed messages. But if he remains strong about supporting the courage and determination of the people of Hong Kong, the people of Taiwan, to be able to choose their own way, to be able to govern themselves, to expand freedom rather than submitting to the controls of the Communist Party, I think he can make an historic contribution that none of the presidents since Richard Nixon had the courage or foresight to try to do. And so if he does those things, the trade conversation and the China conversation, I think it will be a very, very strong campaign. Of course, my dream, which I don't always get my dreams to come true, but my dream is that he would understand that by giving the people of Taiwan and their government the dignity and respect that they deserve, and the right of self-determination that they deserve, would ultimately be the strongest point of leverage in making the Communist Party have to implement trade deals. And so I hope that in the course of what he's doing, he can arrive at that point where we support the government of Taiwan and the people of Taiwan participating openly in our country and in international organizations, no longer allow the Communist Party dictators to tell us what we can say, who we can talk to, and where we can have meetings.
Do you think it will be a very tough task for Taiwan government or Taiwanese people try to see, when you look at the map, how huge China is, how small the Taiwan is? And as far as I'm concerned, all these years, only country can say no to China is maybe only Taiwan. The rest always kowtow to China just because of trade, everything. So I felt not much time for Taiwan. Although so many years they have been saying no everything to China. So I think Taiwan definitely need Mr. Trump's help, though.
They definitely need to know that they do not stand alone.
Do they?
My hope is that the people in the government of Japan can feel comfortable being more open about this. I hope that the government and the people of the United States can be even more open, and maybe some others, because the Communist Party has done an oddly very effective job of reminding people that they're the bad guys. So they're the ones that harass people in Australia. They're the ones that harass people in Canada. They're the ones that harass people in the UK. They're the ones that harass people young and old and students and big companies, big airlines, big hotels, all this stuff. And so they've pushed so hard that I think maybe people are starting to say, you know what? After the NBA humiliation, enough is enough. And we're the United States of America, and we have self-respect and we have core values. We will deal with you when we need to deal with you, and we will give you a degree of respect, but you will not dictate to us.
Well, at this moment, still that day is not coming yet.
Maybe soon, I hope.
In the whole, no matter which country, you were born there, you were raised there, and that's your hometown, that's all you know. And every country, no matter where you are supposed to stand on yourself
Yep.
and make sure that your country is safe from all kinds of attack from neighbors.
Right.
And I think that's a basic knowledge or discipline for the people in the nation. And Japan currently, after war, 75 years, people begin to realize that after all, we are Japanese, we live in Japan, we have to protect our own country.
Right.
I'm pretty sure the trend is changing.
Yeah.
And I hope in Taiwan, the trend should be changing too. And I'm pretty sure after President Lee became a president, that was almost 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So during this 30 years, pretty big change too.
Yes.
So
Much more awareness along
yes.
the lines you described.
We always say America is a big brother. So big brother should help small brother.
Right. But ultimately, small brother will one day take care of big brother.
Why not? That's like
right.
in the family, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yates. So much fun talking to you.
Honor and a
2
privilege.
weeks.
Thank you.
And wish you luck
Thank you so
in
much.
your career.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.